I found out my house had been sold before my husband was even buried. No one told me directly. No one had the courage for that. I heard it the way people like me always hear the truth these days, through a conversation that was not meant for my ears, spoken just loud enough to be careless, just quiet enough to avoid responsibility. I was standing beside Richard's casket, my hand resting on the smooth wood, listening to the low murmur of voices behind me when Lauren said it, as if it were nothing more than a small update, a task checked off a list. The papers are signed. The house is already under contract. Her voice was steady, confident, like she had already stepped into a life where I no longer existed. I did not turn around. I did not react. I simply stood there, looking at the man I had spent 42 years with, and let her words settle in the space between what was happening and what had already been decided. The flowers around me were white lilies, the kind Richard always said smelled too strong, but I had chosen them anyway because he liked the way they looked. That morning, everything had been arranged perfectly. The service was quiet, respectful. People spoke in soft voices, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed. From the outside, it was a proper farewell. Inside, it was something else entirely. I knew when things had started to change. It was not sudden. It never is. It began with small adjustments. Lauren asking about finances in ways that sounded helpful at first. Ethan stepping back from decisions he used to make with me. Papers being moved. Conversations happening without me. I noticed all of it. I just chose not to interrupt it. That was my mistake, according to most people. Silence looks like weakness if you do not understand what it is protecting. Behind me, Lauren continued speaking, explaining details about closing timelines, buyers, numbers, as if she were discussing a business deal instead of the place I had called home for over 3 decades. I could hear Ethan responding, quieter, less certain, but not stopping her. He never stopped her anymore. I finally turned slightly, not enough to face them, just enough to see their reflection in the glass of a framed photo across the room. Lauren stood straight, composed, already in control. Ethan beside her, watching, following. I studied that reflection for a moment, then looked back at the casket. I adjusted my coat, took a slow breath, said nothing. Because the truth was, Lauren had sold something she did not understand. She believed the house was everything. Walls, rooms, structure. That was what she saw. That was what she claimed. But Richard and I had never built our life on walls. We built it on something far more permanent. Something she had never asked about. Something she assumed came with the house. And assumptions have a way of costing people everything. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in grief, but in clarity. Then I opened them again, calm as ever, while behind me, my daughter-in-law continued explaining the future she believed she had already secured, unaware that the foundation beneath it had never belonged to her at all. When the service ended, people approached me one by one with careful smiles and gentle words, each of them offering sympathy that felt sincere but distant, as if they were speaking to someone they believed had already stepped out of her own life. And I accepted each gesture with a quiet nod, thanking them softly, never once letting my voice reveal anything beyond what was expected, because there are moments when dignity matters more than truth, and this was one of them. And as the room slowly emptied, I noticed Lauren moving with purpose, speaking with the funeral director, checking her phone, glancing at Ethan as if confirming that everything was unfolding exactly as planned, and Ethan followed her without question. His movements slower, less certain, but still aligned with hers, and I watched them from across the room without drawing attention to myself, observing the way they occupied the space that used to belong to all of us. And when they finally approached me, Lauren's expression shifted into something softer, something almost polite, as she placed her hand lightly on my arm and said that everything had been taken care of, that I did not need to worry about anything, and I looked at her hand for a brief second before meeting her eyes, and I told her that I was not worried, because that was the truth, just not the truth she thought I meant, and she smiled at that, satisfied, as if my calmness confirmed her assumptions, and Ethan stood beside her, avoiding my gaze, his silence louder than anything he could have said, and Lauren continued, explaining that the house situation had already been handled, that it would be easier this way, that change was necessary, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting, because correction requires urgency, and I had none, and when she finished, she waited, expecting resistance, expecting confusion, expecting something that would justify her control, and I gave her none of it. I simply nodded once, the same way I had earlier, controlled, measured, unreadable, and I said that I understood, and that seemed to ease something in her, as if my agreement had been the final step she needed to secure her version of reality. And she turned slightly toward Ethan, speaking about next steps, timelines, moving arrangements, while I stood there, no longer part of the conversation but still at the center of everything that mattered, and after a moment, I reached for my coat, adjusting it slowly, grounding myself in the familiar motion, and I told them I would be heading home, that I needed some time alone, and Lauren responded with a quick nod, already distracted, already moving forward, and Ethan hesitated for a second, as if he wanted to say something, but he did not, and that told me everything I needed to know, and I walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air, the sky overcast, the lights soft and even, and I took a deep breath, not because I felt overwhelmed, but because clarity has a way of settling in once the noise fades, and I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, deliberate, and I thought about Richard, about the conversations we had in the months before he passed, about the decisions we made quietly, carefully, without announcement, and I started the engine without looking back, because everything that needed to happen next had already been set in motion long before anyone thought to take something from me. And as I drove away, I realized that what Lauren had sold was never truly hers to give, and what I held on to was something she had never even thought to question. The house was exactly as I left it that morning, quiet, still, untouched, as if nothing had changed, as if no one had already decided its future without me, and I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the empty space, and for a moment I stood there in the entryway, letting my eyes adjust not to the light but to the feeling of being present in a place that had already been spoken about as if it no longer belonged to me, and I moved through the living room with deliberate steps, noticing the small details that had always grounded me, the slight crease in the couch cushion where Richard used to sit, the framed photograph on the shelf that Lauren had once suggested replacing with something more modern, the faint scent of wood polish that still lingered from habits I had kept for years, and I did not rush, I did not search, I simply observed, because observation had always given me more than reaction ever could. And, when I reached the kitchen, I placed my keys on the counter and looked out through the window at the stretch of land beyond the house. The same land Richard had insisted we walk every Sunday morning no matter the weather, measuring it in quiet steps rather than numbers, reminding me that what we owned was not just what stood above the ground but what lay beneath it. And I stayed there for a moment longer, my hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, recalling the conversation we had one evening not long before he passed, when he had asked me if I remembered whose name was on the deed, and I had smiled then, not because it was a question that needed answering, but because it was one of those things we had decided together without needing to explain it to anyone else, and I turned away from the window and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, opening the drawer where I kept the documents that had never been part of any discussion Lauren believed she controlled. And I took out the folder, thinner than most, but heavier in its meaning, and I flipped through the pages slowly, not to check them, but to remind myself of the sequence, the structure, the clarity of what had been established long before this moment, and I closed it again, placing it carefully into my bag before returning to the living room, and I sat down in the chair Richard used to occupy, not out of habit but out of recognition, because this was where decisions had always been made. Quietly, without display, and I allowed myself a single breath, steady and measured, before reaching for my phone, not to call anyone immediately, but to confirm what I already knew, and when the screen lit up, I saw the message waiting, brief, professional, expected, confirming that the transaction Lauren had initiated could not proceed as assumed, that certain conditions had not been met, that further review would be required, and I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I understood exactly how it would unfold from here, and I set the phone down gently on the table, my expression unchanged, my posture calm, because the shift had already begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, precise way that real consequences tend to appear, and somewhere, not far from this moment, Lauren would begin to realize that what she thought she had secured was never hers to claim, and when she did, there would be nothing left for me to explain. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet that settles into a house when something has already shifted but has not yet been acknowledged, and I moved through my routine as I always had, preparing coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light in slowly, not because I needed comfort but because consistency has a way of revealing what no longer fits, and I noticed it immediately, the subtle difference in how the space felt, not empty, not unfamiliar, but waiting, as if the house itself understood what was about to unfold, and I carried my cup to the table, sitting down in the same chair, my hands steady, my thoughts clear, and I did not have to wait long before the first sign appeared, my phone vibrating softly against the surface, the screen lighting up with a name I recognized without hesitation, and I answered without greeting, because formalities were unnecessary at this point, and the voice on the other end was measured, professional, but no longer neutral. There was a shift in tone that comes only when expectations have been interrupted, and he explained that the buyers had been notified, that the title company had flagged an issue, that the sale could not proceed as planned, and I listened without interrupting, not because I was surprised, but because I had been expecting this exact moment, and when he finished I simply thanked him, not for the information, but for confirming what had already been set in motion, and I ended the call without further discussion, placing the phone back on the table as calmly as I had picked it up, and I took another sip of coffee, letting the silence return, knowing it would not last long, and it did not, because less than an hour later, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, faster than usual, sharper, not the measured arrival of someone in control, but the urgent return of someone who has just realized something is wrong. And I remained seated, not moving toward the door, not preparing for confrontation, just waiting, because there was no need to meet urgency with urgency. And the front door opened with more force than necessary, footsteps crossing the floor quickly, and then Lauren's voice, no longer controlled, no longer composed, calling out my name with a tone that carried something new, something unfamiliar to her, and I stood slowly, setting my cup down before turning toward the hallway, my movements deliberate, unhurried, and when I stepped into the living room, she was already there, her posture tense, her expression tightened, the confidence she carried the day before now replaced with something less stable, and Ethan stood behind her, quieter than ever, watching, waiting, and Lauren spoke first, asking what I had done. Her words direct, stripped of politeness, and I looked at her calmly, not with challenge, not with defensiveness, just with clarity, and I told her I had done nothing, because that was the truth. I had not needed to do anything. And she took a step closer, her voice sharper now, explaining that the sale had been stopped, that there was an issue with the land, that the transaction could not move forward, and I listened, letting her finish, letting her piece together the parts she had overlooked, and when she paused, waiting for an explanation, I gave her one, simple, precise, and final. I told her that the house could be sold, but the land could not by her, not by anyone but me, and the room fell still in that quiet, irreversible way that comes when something undeniable has just been said, and I watched as the realization settled into her expression. slowly, unwillingly, as if understanding itself was something she had not prepared for. And I said nothing more, because there was nothing left to explain. Lauren did not speak immediately after that, and the silence that followed was different from anything that had come before. Not the kind of silence that waits for a response, but the kind that settles in when there is nothing left to argue against. And I watched her closely, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same quiet attention I had given everything else, because moments like this reveal more than words ever could. And her posture shifted slightly, the tension in her shoulders no longer controlled but strained, her eyes moving quickly as if searching for something that might still support the version of reality she had been holding on to. And Ethan stepped forward then, his voice uncertain, asking what that meant, not to challenge me, but to understand, and I turned my gaze to him, seeing not the man he had become beside her, but the boy who once asked questions without fear of the answer. And I told him simply that ownership is not always visible, that what stands on the surface does not always define what is truly held, and he absorbed that slowly, his expression tightening as the pieces began to fall into place, and Lauren exhaled sharply, breaking the quiet, insisting that the documents had been reviewed, that everything had been clear, that the sale had been legitimate, and I did not contradict her, because in a way she was right. Everything she had seen had been clear, just not complete, and I explained calmly that the structure of the house and the ownership of the land had always been separate, that Richard and I had arranged it that way years ago, long before she had ever taken interest in the details, and I saw it then, the exact moment the realization settled fully, not as confusion, but as recognition of something she had never considered. And she stepped back slightly, her voice lower now, asking why she had not known, and I answered without hesitation, telling her that she had never asked because people who believe they already understand rarely look deeper, and the words were not harsh, not raised, but they carried a weight that did not need emphasis. And Ethan looked between us, his expression no longer uncertain but unsettled, as if the foundation he had relied on had shifted beneath him. And I moved past them then, not to leave the conversation, but to end it, because there was nothing left that required discussion. And I returned to the kitchen, picking up my cup, now empty, rinsing it slowly under the faucet, the familiar motion grounding the moment in something ordinary, and behind me, I could feel the space change again, not in my favor, not against them, but simply back into balance, where assumptions no longer held power over facts. And after a few seconds, I heard Lauren speak again, her tone quieter, measured, asking what would happen next. And I turned slightly, meeting her gaze just once, and I told her that what happens next is not decided by what was attempted, but by what was established long before any of this began. And I did not elaborate further, because explanation was no longer necessary. And as I set the cup aside and walked toward the window once more, I knew that the control she believed she had taken had never truly existed. It had only been borrowed from a misunderstanding that had now come to an end. The rest of the afternoon passed without urgency, but the air inside the house felt different, no longer shaped by assumptions or quiet control, but by something clearer, something grounded in what could not be rewritten. And I remained near the window for a while, looking out over the land that stretched beyond the fence line, the same land Richard had once told me would outlast every wall we ever built on it. And I understood now that he had not been speaking about property alone. He had been speaking about permanence, about the difference between what can be taken and what cannot. And behind me, I could hear them moving, slower than before, their footsteps no longer confident, their voices low, measured, as if they were both trying to adjust to a reality that had shifted without warning. And I did not turn immediately. I let that moment exist, because sometimes people need silence to understand what words cannot explain. And after a while, Ethan spoke first, his voice careful, asking what this meant for the house, not with resistance, but with a need to understand what remained. And I turned then, meeting his eyes, and I told him that the house still stood, that nothing had been taken from it, but that what supported it, what gave it meaning and value, had never been part of what they tried to transfer. And he nodded slowly, absorbing that, his expression no longer defensive but thoughtful, as if he was beginning to see the structure beneath everything he had Accepted without question, and Lauren remained quiet for a moment longer before speaking again, her tone different now, not sharp, not controlled, but restrained, asking if there was any way to move forward, any way to complete what had already been started. And I considered her question carefully, not because I needed to think, but because precision matters when clarity is finally required, and I told her that moving forward is always possible, but not in the direction she had chosen. Not without understanding what was actually in place, and she listened, her posture still, her expression no longer certain, and I continued, explaining that the land determined everything, that without it, the house was nothing more than a structure without foundation, and that foundation had never changed ownership, not in any document she had signed, not in any agreement she had made, and the words settled into the room quietly, without force, but with finality, and Ethan lowered his gaze. Briefly, as if recognizing something he had overlooked for far too long, and Lauren took a step back, her shoulders no longer squared, her confidence replaced with something more cautious, more aware, and I moved away from the window then, walking past them without hesitation, not to leave, but to reposition myself within a space that had always been mine, and I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, my posture steady, my presence unchanged, and I realized that nothing had truly been taken. From me, not the house, not the land, not even my place within this family. What had changed was their understanding of it. And as the room settled into that quiet recognition, I knew that whatever came next would not be driven by assumption, but by truth, and truth does not need to raise its voice to be heard. The house remained quiet after that conversation, not empty, not abandoned, but settled in a way that felt different from before, as if something had finally been restored to its proper place without needing to be announced. And I noticed how both of them moved more carefully now, their steps slower, their voices lower, no longer carrying the same certainty they had walked in with, and I stayed where I was for a while longer, not to observe them, but to allow the moment to complete itself, because some shifts require time to be fully understood. And after a while Ethan spoke again, his tone measured, asking if there had ever been a point where things could have been different. Not accusing, not defensive, just searching, and I considered that for a moment, not because the answer was unclear, but because it deserved precision, and I told him that things are always different when people choose to understand before they act, and he nodded slowly, as if that answer carried more weight than anything else I could have said, and Lauren remained quiet beside him, her posture still, her expression thoughtful in a way it had not been before, as if she was finally seeing not just the outcome, but the path that had led to it. And I stood then, not abruptly, not with intention to leave, but simply to move, because staying in one place too long can make moments feel heavier than they are meant to be, and I walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly as I passed them, not to acknowledge, not to dismiss, but to exist in the same space without conflict, and I continued into the next room, where the late afternoon light softened everything it touched, and I opened the drawer once more, not to check the documents, but to place them back where they belonged, because their purpose had already been fulfilled, and as I closed it, I realized that what had been resolved here was not just about ownership, not just about land or structure, but about something quieter, something more lasting, the understanding that control built on assumption does not hold. And when I returned to the living room, they were both still there, but no longer positioned as they had been before, no longer standing together in certainty, but existing separately in thought. And Ethan looked up at me, his expression steady, and he said that he understood now, not everything, but enough, and I nodded once, because understanding does not need to be complete to be meaningful. And Lauren finally spoke, her voice softer, asking what I wanted to do next, and I met her gaze calmly, not with resistance, not with triumph, but with clarity, and I told her that what comes next does not need to be decided immediately, that not everything requires a quick resolution, and that some things are better handled with the same care they were built with, and she listened, not interrupting, not challenging, just absorbing, and I could see that something in her had shifted, not entirely, not permanently, but enough to change how she would move forward. And I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, the same steady posture I had carried from the beginning, and I understood then that the real change had not been in what I had done, but in what they had finally seen. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be returned to misunderstanding, and that, more than anything else, is what changes everything. That evening settled in slowly, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but complete, and I remained in the living room as the light outside softened into a pale gold that stretched across the floor, touching the edges of the furniture, the walls, the photographs that had not been moved this time, and I noticed that neither of them spoke for a while, not out of tension, but out of something closer to reflection, as if both were recalibrating their place within a structure they had only just begun to understand. And I did not interrupt that silence, because silence, when it is no longer defensive, has a way of doing more than any explanation ever could. And after some time Ethan stood, moving toward the window where I had stood earlier, his posture slower, more deliberate, and he looked out at the land without saying anything, as if seeing it for the first time not as something that came with the house, but as something separate, something foundational. And I watched him from where I sat, not with expectation, but with quiet acknowledgement, because understanding, once it begins, tends to unfold on its own. And Lauren remained seated, her hands resting together, her gaze lowered for a moment before she lifted it again. And when she spoke, her voice was steady but changed, no longer shaped by control, but by consideration. And she said that she had misjudged the situation, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that suggested she was no longer speaking to defend herself. And I listened without responding immediately, allowing the words to exist without interruption, because acceptance, when it is genuine, does not need to be challenged. And she continued, explaining that she had assumed responsibility without fully understanding what she was taking on, that she had moved forward based on what seemed obvious rather than what was true. And I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because assumptions often feel like certainty until they are tested. And Ethan turned then, looking between us. His expression settled in a way I had not seen before, and he said that things needed to be handled differently from now on, not as a question, but as a statement. And I met his gaze calmly, acknowledging that without needing to add anything further, and the room shifted again, not dramatically, but with a quiet alignment that had been missing before. And I stood, moving toward the doorway, not to leave, but to transition, because moments like this do not require closure, they require continuation. And I paused briefly, looking back at both of them, not as opposition, not as distance, but as part of a structure that had always been more complex than they realized. And I told them that what matters is not what was done, but what is understood from it. And I left it there, because understanding is not something that can be forced, only recognized. And as I stepped into the hallway, the house felt steady beneath me, not changed, not reclaimed, but exactly as it had always been, grounded in something deeper than ownership, something that does not shift with decisions made too quickly. And I knew then that whatever came next would not need to be defended, because it would already be rooted in what could not be undone. The night settled fully by the time I returned to the living room, and the house felt quieter than it had in a long time, not because there was no one in it, but because nothing inside it was being forced into place anymore. And I walked slowly across the room, my steps steady, my attention drawn not to what had changed, but to what had remained the same through all of it, the structure, the light, the quiet strength that had always been there beneath the surface of everything else. And I paused near the window once more, looking out at the land as it disappeared into the darkness beyond, and I understood then that what mattered had never been the house itself, not the walls, not the rooms, not even the years attached to them, but the foundation beneath it, the part that could not be assumed, could not be transferred without understanding, and could not be taken simply because someone believed they had the right. And behind me, I could hear them again, not speaking loudly, not arguing, just existing in a space that no longer belonged to one version of the truth. And after a moment, Ethan stepped forward, stopping a few feet away, his voice calm as he said that he had been wrong, not in a way that asked for forgiveness, but in a way that acknowledged something had been overlooked. And I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, because acknowledgement, when it is real, does not need to be shaped or guided. And Lauren remained where she was, her posture no longer rigid, her presence quieter, as if she understood that there was nothing left to assert. And I turned slightly, meeting both of their gazes, not with distance, not with judgment, but with clarity. and I told them that what had happened did not need to be undone, because it had already revealed what needed to be seen, and that from here what mattered was not control, not ownership in the way they had tried to define it, but understanding, and I let the words settle without adding anything further, because explanation beyond that would have only reduced what had already become clear, and I moved past them, not leaving the room, but reclaiming my place within it in the simplest way possible, by existing without hesitation. And I sat down once more, my posture steady, my hands resting lightly in my lap, and I realized that nothing about this moment required victory, because there had been no battle in the way they had imagined, only a shift from assumption to truth. And as the silence returned, softer now, more balanced, I understood that what I had held onto had never needed to be defended. It had only needed to remain where it belonged, and that was enough, not just for this house, not just for this land, but for everything that would come after it, because once something is grounded in what cannot be taken, it no longer needs to prove its place.